Ever wondered why we haven't sent astronauts back to the moon in over 50 years? It's been more than half a century since Neil Armstrong's legendary moonwalk, but our footprints on the lunar surface remain undisturbed. So, what happened? Why did NASA hit the brakes on the lunar missions? All this raises a big question. Did we even land on the moon in the first place? Or has it all been an elaborate hoax? Stay tuned to uncover the truth. Imagine finding yourself in a heated argument about whether humans really set foot on the moon on July 20th, 1969. If you do, you might be caught off guard. Most folks accept without question that the US government, NASA, the 12 astronauts who walked on the moon, and the 400,000 people who worked on the Apollo program couldn't and wouldn't fake one of humanity's greatest accomplishments. However, some people believe the moon landings were a massive hoax. They argue that the US government staged the Apollo 11 mission and the ones that followed to outshine the USSR in the space race, secure more funding for NASA, or distract from the Vietnam War. The crux of these theories is the need to prove the landings were faked. Skeptics often point to oddities in photos and videos as supposed evidence. But the entire conspiracy theory began with just one man, Bill Kaysing. Kaysing's journey started with a hunch, an intuition, which grew into a firm belief that the US didn't have the technical know-how to make it to the moon and back. Kaysing had a loose connection to the US space program, having worked at Rocketdyne, a company that helped design the Saturn V rocket engines from 1956 to 1963. In 1976, he self-published a pamphlet titled "We Never Went to the Moon, America's $30 Billion Swindle." Filled with grainy photocopies and wild theories, his work somehow laid the groundwork for persistent myths that still thrive in Hollywood films, Fox News documentaries, Reddit threads, and YouTube channels. And despite a mountain of evidence, 382 kilograms of moon rock from 6 missions, confirmations from Russia, Japan, and China, and NASA Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter images showing astronauts' tracks in the moon dust, the moon hoax conspiracy has thrived since 1969. Among 9/11 truthers, anti-vaxxers, flat earthers, Holocaust deniers, and Sandy Hook conspiracies, the idea that the moon landings were faked isn't even controversial anymore. It's just accepted as fact. Even big names like podcast king Joe Rogan and YouTuber Sean Dawson are skeptics. A sociology professor in New Jersey was caught telling his students the landings were staged. Unlike Kaysing, who used photocopied pamphlets to spread his message, today's conspiracists have platforms like the subreddit r/moonhoax. There, they claim NASA was so lazy they used the same moon rover for Apollo 15, 16, and 17, or assert that they have been trolling us for years, or voice their doubts with lines like, "There's one thing I can't get my head around." The reality is, the internet has given people a megaphone to broadcast whatever wild theory they want to a massive audience. And let's face it, Americans have a soft spot for conspiracy theories. Whenever something big happens, there's always someone ready with an alternative explanation. So, how do you respond when someone points to anomalies as proof that the moon landing was a hoax? Here are the most common arguments and see why they don't hold water. One popular claim is that there are no stars in the Apollo photos. Since space is free from Earth's light pollution, shouldn't there be thousands of stars visible in the astronauts' pictures? This argument misses one crucial point. All the moon missions happened during the lunar daytime. The bright lunar surface outshined the distant stars, making them too faint to be captured in the photos. Another argument centers on the crosshairs in many Apollo images, which sometimes seem to be behind objects. Conspiracists argue that this would be impossible if the images were real, suggesting they were doctored. However, tests on Earth show that brightly lit objects can cause crosshairs to appear fainter. When these images are copied or scanned, some detail can be lost, making it look like the crosshairs are behind objects. Then there's the infamous C on a moon rock from the Apollo 16 mission. It looks like a labeled movie prop, but examining the original photo reveals no such anomaly. Most likely, the C was a stray hair or thread that got introduced during the copying process. Perhaps the most compelling arguments for moon landing deniers involves the Van Allen belts. These two massive donut-shaped regions surround the Earth and are packed with highly energetic charged particles from the solar wind. Some skeptics argue that humans couldn't have passed through these belts without receiving lethal doses of radiation. Before the Apollo missions, this was a legitimate concern. To address it, the scientists behind Apollo 11 took significant precautions to protect the astronauts. They outfitted the spacecraft with an aluminum shell to shield against radiation and plotted a course that minimized the time spent in the Van Allen belts. Data from the 9 Apollo missions that reached the moon revealed that the astronauts' average radiation exposure was 0.46 radiation absorbed dose. Rad. This confirmed that NASA's precautions were effective. While this level of radiation is lower than what some nuclear energy workers experience, it's still about 10 times more than what medical professionals typically encounter when working with X-ray and radiotherapy machines. Now, of course, until we make another trip to the moon, there will always be anomalies and oddities in the records that can spark fresh claims that the moon landings were faked. But the sheer volume and variety of evidence we have is overwhelming and debunk every one of these claims. From the Apollo moon missions, we have a treasure trove of 8,400 publicly available photos, thousands of hours of video footage, a mountain of scientific data, and complete transcripts and audio recordings of all air-to-ground conversations. Apollo astronauts even brought back 382 kilograms of moon rock. These rocks have been independently verified as lunar by labs worldwide, debunking any notion of a U.S. conspiracy. Still not convinced? NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, LRO, might change your mind. This orbiter takes high-resolution photos of the lunar surface, capturing the landing sites, abandoned descent modules, and rovers from the Apollo missions. The LRO's images are so detailed, they even show the dark squiggly paths left by astronaut footprints. Spacecraft from China, India, and Japan have also identified these landing sites, providing further independent verification. One final piece of irrefutable evidence is a simple instrument installed 55 years ago by Apollo 11. During their historic day on the moon, Armstrong and Aldrin placed a lunar laser ranging retroreflector array on the surface. This array is still operational today, allowing us to bounce lasers off it and measure the distance to the moon with centimeter accuracy. We simply couldn't do this if we hadn't been to the moon. Now, let's tackle another question that's probably on your mind. If NASA went to the moon, why haven't they sent astronauts back since then? Well, first off, the end of the space race between the US and Russia played a big role. Once the Americans beat the Soviet Union to the moon, the intense competition that fueled those missions cooled off. With the race seemingly won, the urgency to continue moon missions faded. Secondly, moon trips are incredibly dangerous and risky. The successful Apollo missions faced numerous life-threatening challenges. So, if you're dreaming of taking your sweetheart to the moon and back, think again. Plus, there's no Starbucks up there. The Apollo program had its share of close calls. Apollo 1 tragically lost 3 astronauts in a launch pad fire. Then there was Apollo 13, where an oxygen tank explosion nearly ended in disaster, though thankfully the crew made it back safely. Neil Armstrong himself had a few near-death experiences. About 14 months before Apollo 11, he almost died in a lunar landing training accident. And during Apollo 11's actual mission, a U.S. Air Force meteorologist named Hank Bradley helped avert disaster by detecting a severe thunderstorm in their re-entry path, allowing NASA to redirect the spacecraft for a safe landing. Other hazards of moon travel include the fine, clingy moon dust, the 14-day stretches of darkness, the extreme heat during lunar day, and the threat of wandering asteroids. With all these dangers, it's no wonder NASA's been cautious about returning. Lastly, let's talk about the astronomical cost. Moon missions are outrageously expensive. While the Kennedy administration initially budgeted around $7 billion for the Apollo program, the final bill was over $20 billion, equivalent to about $264 billion today. The project involved over 400,000 people and support from more than 20,000 companies and universities. The high costs led President Richard Nixon to question the value of returning to the moon, given the immense financial and human resources required. So, between the end of the space race, the significant risks, and the staggering costs, there are plenty of reasons why NASA hasn't been back to the moon. But is NASA planning to return to the moon? The short answer, yes. On March 17, 2022, the world's largest set of doors opened at the Kennedy Space Center in Merritt Island, Florida, revealing an aeronautical marvel. Inside NASA's largest facility stood their newest and most powerful rocket ever created, towering over 100 meters tall. That evening, a massive wheeled platform gently moved the mega rocket out of the facility and through the coastal night to its launch site. Unlike any rocket in the last 50 years, this one will carry humans to the moon. NASA aims to send astronauts back to the lunar surface, more than 55 years after the last Apollo mission. This new program is called Artemis, named after Apollo's twin sister in Greek mythology. The Space Launch System, SLS rocket, which kicked off the Artemis era, launched in 2022. During the Artemis 1 mission, NASA's new mega moon rocket, the SLS, roared into the night sky, sending the Orion spacecraft on a 1.4 million mile journey beyond the moon and back. It launched on November 16, 2022, and splashed down on December 11th. This uncrewed flight test was the first in a series of increasingly complex missions, paving the way for the first woman and the first person of color to step foot on the lunar surface by 2025. The Artemis program also aims to establish a long-term presence on the moon, setting the stage for future crewed missions to Mars. What do you think? Do you believe this mission will be successful? And were the moon landings real or a hoax? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.